Chapter 7. The Japanese. The history of Japanese Americans is a story of tragedy and triumph. Few people ever came to America more predisposed and determined to be good Americans. Few met such repeated rebuffs and barriers, including barriers of mass internment camps, or more completely triumphed over it all across a broad spectrum of economic, social, and political success. Much of the history of Japanese Americans was shaped by attitudes, prejudices, and discrimination against Chinese Americans, who preceded them to the United States by a generation. Both groups were lumped together in the popular mind as Orientals, or as the Yellow Peril, although in fact they have been and remained separate and distinct groups. International relations between Japan and the United States also influenced the history of Japanese Americans. But in the end, the unusual history of Japanese Americans was shaped by the unusual qualities these people brought with them across the Pacific. Japan. Emigration from Japan to the United States began in the late 19th century, at a crucial stage in the history of Japan. In 1868, the ruling shoguns of the Tokugawa clan were overthrown, to be replaced not only by a new set of political rulers, but also by a whole new set of values and national aspirations. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 marked the beginning of modern Japan, emerging from centuries of feudalism and isolation into modern industrialism and into international commerce, cultural exchange, and war. Japan had long been one of the world's most isolated nations. When the first Encyclopedia Britannica was published in the 18th century, it covered all that was known about Japan in the West in one sentence, giving its latitude and longitude. As late as the middle of the 19th century, very restricted access to Japan was permitted in only one port, Nagasaki. Japan's isolation was forcibly ended in 1854, when Commodore Perry brought a fleet of U.S. Navy fighting ships into Tokyo Bay and induced the Japanese government to sign a treaty giving broader access to the country by Americans. This action not only brought Japan into contact with Western ideas and technology, it also made it painfully clear how far behind the West Japan was at that point in its history, and how costly its total isolation had been. In a sense, it set the agenda for Japanese political developments for the next 100 years, equaling and surpassing the West. Resentment of the West for its arrogance was combined or alternated with admiration for its accomplishments that made such power possible. Japan of the Meiji Restoration was a nation all but obsessed with the West. It was the Japanese of that era who immigrated to America. It was the culture and values of that period that remained dominant in Japanese American communities in the United States, long after Japan itself had evolved further. Japanese immigrants to other countries at other times carried a very different culture with them. As a 20th century writer in Japan observed, if you want to see Japan of the Taisho era, 1912 to 1926, go to Brazil. If you want to see Japan of the Meiji era, 1868 to 1912, go to America. Japanese attitudes toward the West. Meiji Japan introduced the study of English in its secondary schools in 1876, permitted the establishment of Christian churches and schools, and its leaders and intellectuals publicly expressed strong admiration for the United States and the American way of life. The United States was described as an earthly paradise, a benefactor to Japan by ending its isolation, and American freedom was extolled as something to be both envied and emulated. Government-issued textbooks in the schools held up Benjamin Franklin and Abraham Lincoln as models to be followed by Japanese children, even more so than Japanese heroes. Perhaps never before has a foreign people been so indoctrinated with the American way of life as those of Meiji Japan. The desire to win the acceptance and respect of Americans was to become and remain a major theme in the later history of Japanese Americans, descendants of those who emigrated from Japan in the Meiji era. The perception of the West in Meiji Japan induced both self-denigration and ultra-nationalistic self-assertion. the latter sometimes viewed by the Japanese themselves as a psychological defense over compensation. Both assertions of inferiority of the Japanese people and denials of it were frequent in Japanese publications of the Meiji era. For example, in the 1880s, a Japanese writer bluntly asserted that the Japanese people do not have ability, and another Japanese writer spoke of the slow comprehension power and weak physique of our people. Ultranationalism, traditionalism, and militarism were among the reactions to such feelings. The worship of the emperor as the divine leader of the Japanese race was an innovation of the later Meiji period, not yet the pervasive influence it was to become in Japan. Immigrants to the United States were already adults by the time emperor worship reached its zenith and were so critical of it and other aspects of Japanese ultranationalism that many publications by Japanese Americans were banned in Japan. Some indication of Japan's internal ambivalence was the emotional reaction in Japan to its successful war against China, 1895, and then against Russia, 1905. The first time an Asian nation had defeated a Western nation. Because Japan has defeated the ancient and great country of China, one Japanese newspaper editorialized, the diffident Japanese people were now convinced that they are not inferior to other races. Before this, the Japanese had viewed the civilized nations of the West as the penniless do the extremely rich. That is, outwardly they talk big, saying they are people and we are people, but if their innermost thoughts are probed, they fear Western capability, power, and knowledge, and are resigned to the thought that they possibly cannot ever win in competition with them. By 1899, Japan was confident enough to end the extraterritoriality that it had granted Westerners, and in the early 20th century it was ready to challenge and defeat Tsarist Russia. Economic conditions. Internally, Meiji Japan wrestled with the problem of maintaining traditional control while dismantling feudalism and selectively adopting Western ideas, including capitalism and modern technology. This involved many social dislocations and political stresses. Modern conceptions of property and contracts gave farmers freedom of movement and occupation, but also enabled landowners to oust tenant farmers from the land whenever this proved economically expedient. The old samurai warriors were pensioned off and declined economically and socially, pulling down with them the merchants and craftsmen who had served their needs. New export markets brought prosperity to some industries, such as silk and tea production, but competition from imports brought declines to other Japanese industries, such as cotton cloth. Farmers, who were 80% of the population, suffered from heavy taxes, continued from the previous Tokugawa regime, and engaged in numerous riots, also continued from the previous regime. Population and migration. Overlaying these economic and political developments was the rapid growth of the Japanese population. The Japanese population grew 30% in just over a quarter of a century, reaching 44 million in 1900. This was due to both declining death rates with improvements in sanitation and to rising birth rates. The additional population flowed from the countryside into the cities. The population in agriculture continued at the same level as before, while city populations swelled. The average standard of living of the middle class rose, but the dislocations were severe for many, as indicated by such things as rising unemployment and family suicide rates. Meiji Japan was a country in which people could no longer simply follow ready-made patterns of work and life, as in feudal times, but now had to look for work and seek to make a place for themselves in the world. Many sought opportunities overseas, where standards of living were much higher than in Japan. Contemporary American workers were earning 5 to 10 times what Japanese workers were receiving in Japan. Although the Japanese had long been a village-bound people, the new economic conditions of the Meiji era had made internal migration a familiar pattern, both to those who relocated to the city and those who became migratory workers moving from one end of the country to the other. The tension between village consciousness and migratory work patterns was resolved by leaving and returning. Many traveled to seek economic benefits within Japan and beyond, and yet came back to live among family and neighborhoods and to be buried with their ancestors. Leaving for a foreign land was not seen as emigration, but as a sojourn, as in the manner of the Italians or the Chinese. But while many Japanese carried out their plans for return migration, many others did not, also like the Italians and the Chinese. The decision to migrate, even temporarily, was not a random individual decision. Neither was the destination chosen. In Japan, as in other countries, the particular destinations and experiences of the initial emigrants strongly affected the later migration patterns of those from their respective localities in Japan. This continued to be true even in post-World War II Japan. For example, 90% of those who emigrated from Miho village in post-war Japan settled in one specific area of Canada. More than 90% of Okinawan immigrants to the United States went to Hawaii, while 8% reached the continental United States. In an earlier era, over half of all Okinawans from one district went to the Philippines. Ironically, one of the Japanese prefectures that sent a concentration of people to the United States during the initial immigration period and in the 20th century was Hiroshima. Part of the reason for such patterns were human ties based on family, friends, or local acquaintances. Partly it was the result of the activities of commercial recruitment organizations that found it economical to concentrate in a limited area in soliciting people to work overseas. Immigration began in the first year of the Meiji era, 1868, when 148 contract laborers sailed from Japan to Hawaii. Mutual dissatisfaction of Hawaiians and Japanese led the Japanese government to intervene, repatriating some workers immediately and allowing no others to go to Hawaii for many years. Japan's interest in Japanese overseas and its possession of the national power and prestige to intervene in their behalf were factors distinguishing Japan from contemporary China, which was too weak to prevent itself from being dismembered, much less effectively act on behalf of overseas Chinese. The general effectiveness of Japan's control of its working conditions abroad need not be exaggerated, however, but it was there and was an influence to be reckoned with. Dire economic conditions in Japan in 1885 forced the Japanese government to reconsider its ban on immigration to Hawaii. In 1886, an informal agreement between Hawaii and Japan permitted the resumption of Japanese migration, which supplied the growing sugar plantations with much-needed workers. Japan controlled the selection of these temporary emigrants. Whereas the first Japanese emigrants had been urbanized workers from the prefectures of Hiroshima and Yamaguchi, the later contract laborers were from a farming and fishing community in the latter prefecture, avoiding the mismatching of workers and work that had contributed to the early mutual disappointments of the Japanese and the Hawaiians. Almost all the Japanese who went to Hawaii in this era became plantation workers in the sugarcane fields. They were overwhelmingly young males. Japanese migration to the United States began in the same era as their movement to Hawaii, which did not become an American possession until 1898. Japanese migration to the mainland of the United States was just over 200 in the decade of the 1860s, less than 200 in the decade of the 1870s, but rose rapidly thereafter. More than 2,000 Japanese moved to the mainland of the United States during the 1880s, then tripled this during the 1890s, and reached a peak of more than 100,000 in the first decade of the 20th century. After the restrictive American immigration laws of the 1920s, very few Japanese entered the United States. The Japanese migration was predominantly male, 7 times as many males as females in 1890 and 24 times as many in 1900, and involved much return migration. Many stayed, however. Less than half the passports issued by Japan for travel to the United States in the 1880s and 1890s were ever returned, whereas most Japanese who went to Russia or China did return their passports. The sex imbalance among Japanese in Hawaii was less, although still substantial. There were 3.5 males to every female among the Japanese in Hawaii in 1900, about 2 to 1 in 1910, and only 16% more males than females by 1930. The migration of Japanese to the United States thus had the classic characteristics of a temporary or tentative migration. The Japanese government, in fact, designated the emigrants as temporary, and American law growing out of anti-Chinese feelings made Asians ineligible for American citizenship. Nevertheless, many who came chose to stay. The people who left Japan were usually neither the lowest nor the highest classes. Although the Japanese are justly known for their hard work and careful savings, just such traits were by no means universal across the class structures. In Meiji Japan, there were lower classes in which the money earned by the right hand is quickly spent by the left hand, and in which absenteeism from work was common right after payday. Such people did not go to America. Neither did the nobility. The Japanese who migrated to Hawaii or to the United States were the ambitious young men of limited means from farming backgrounds who could get family and village notables to vouch for them and to agree to be responsible for their passage expenses. They more than repaid their debts. The average amount of money sent back annually by migrants from the Hiroshima prefecture in the early 20th century was more than 2 years' average earnings in Japan. Similar patterns were found in other prefectures. The average savings brought back to Japan by migrants from one district of Hiroshima were greater than the average annual income of the top 1% of the Japanese population. Such results reflected the great differences in economic conditions between Japan and the United States, as well as the frugality of Japanese migrants. Many of those who returned to Japan could not only pay off obligations incurred for passage money, but had enough left to buy substantial amounts of farmland or to go into business. Japanese villages that had many emigrants in the United States or migrants returning from the United States tended to be visibly more prosperous, even if they had been poverty-stricken before. Homes were more expensive and often of Western design. Nationally, the sums of money were significant, alongside Japan's international balance of payments. Locally, as in Hiroshima Prefecture, the remittances and sums brought back amounted to more than half as much as the whole prefecture government spent. In short, the importance of Japanese migrants in America was substantial in Japan. It may even be that the money earned in America helped build Hiroshima into such an industrial center that it became a prime military target in World War II. The Japanese in America. The Japanese were initially welcomed, both in Hawaii and in the United States. They were a pre-selected group of healthy young men of good reputation, ambitious enough to venture thousands of miles from their homeland. They made excellent workers in the hard labor of Hawaiian sugarcane plantations. On the mainland of the United States, about 40% began as agricultural laborers, and the rest worked in a variety of other strenuous laboring tasks on railroads and in mines, lumber mills, canneries, meat-packing plants, and similar arduous occupations. Some became personal servants to affluent Americans. In all these occupations, the Japanese accepted low pay, long hours, and difficult working conditions without complaint. One indication of their diligence is that when they were paid on a piecework basis in agriculture, they earned up to twice as much as other laborers. When the Japanese worked as assistants to whites, they willingly carried out not only the responsibilities of their own jobs, but often many of the duties belonging to the white workers. In this way, they acquired higher skills and experience that could later be useful to themselves. Like some others speaking a foreign language and having special diets, the Japanese often worked together, supervised by a labor contractor of their own nationality. The Japanese migrants were marvels of thrift as well as industry, steadily saving small amounts from wages that were low by American standards, but high by the standards of Japan. When the Japanese were paid by the hour instead of by piecework, they were initially paid less than whites, about 14% less. But about half the Japanese were either contract laborers or piece workers, and in these cases earned more than whites doing the same work. The very virtues of the Japanese eventually turned others against them. While Japanese migrants made excellent employees, that made them rivals, feared and hated by American workers and American labor unions. AFL President Samuel Gompers denounced Asian workers and refused to allow them into unions, even in segregated locals. The thrift, diligence, and ambitions of the Japanese meant that increasing numbers of them began to move up from the ranks of labor to become small farmers or small businessmen. With that, the American farmers and businessmen who had welcomed the Japanese as employees turned bitterly against them as rivals. Moreover, the occupational and geographical concentration of the Japanese in a relatively few specialties in a few communities in California made them far more visible targets than otherwise. As the Japanese in California moved up from the ranks of agricultural laborers to tenant farmers, or, more rarely, landowners, the hostility against them as competitors rose from the white agricultural laborers to the white farmers. The additional hostility, now including a more influential class, was enough to launch a wave of anti-Japanese legislation and practices that continued for decades in California. Chief among these was the Alien Land Law of 1913, which forbade the owning of California land by aliens ineligible for citizenship, that is, Asians in general and Japanese in particular. At the national level, California led the political drive to stop Japanese immigrants from being admitted to the United States. Because Japan was emerging as a major world power around the turn of the century, having defeated China in war in 1895 and Russia in 1905, the ending of Japanese immigration to the United States could not be done in the same abrupt, unilateral, and contemptuous manner in which Chinese immigration had been stopped a generation earlier. A face-saving device was worked out between the American and Japanese governments, known as the Gentlemen's Agreement of 1908. Under the terms of this agreement, Japan itself severely limited the number of immigrants to the United States, and the American government allowed the wives of existing Japanese in the United States to join their husbands and for parents and children to be reunited here. In this way, the extreme sex imbalance that accompanied the cutoff of Chinese immigration was not quite so severe among Japanese Americans. Much of the reduced emigration from Japan after the Gentlemen's Agreement consisted of women. While initially the sex imbalance among the Japanese on the mainland of the United States was comparable to that among the first generation of Chinese, about 24 Japanese men to every Japanese woman in 1900, the imbalance was reduced substantially over the years. By 1910, there were only 7 Japanese men to every Japanese woman, and by 1920, less than 2 to 1. Some of the women who came were wives joining their husbands, and some were women married in Japan by proxy so that they could be legally brought to America. These latter were so-called picture brides, chosen by the family in Japan and accepted by the Japanese male in America after having seen a photograph. Arranged marriages were common in Japan, and these trans-Pacific couples were typically matched by regional and social backgrounds. But the practice was shocking to Americans and added to anti-Japanese feeling. Nevertheless, the forming of a family on American soil marked a putting down of roots. With this act, the Japanese were no longer migrants or sojourners. They became Japanese Americans. Many continued to return to Japan, including some of the females sent from Japan. Those who stayed were, however, the first generation of Japanese American immigrants, the Issei, as distinguished from the Nisei, second generation, and Sansei, third generation. The immigrant generation. Unlike other nations, Japan did not send America its tired, its poor, its huddled masses. The Japanese were perhaps unique among immigrants to America in the extent to which they were a highly selected sample of their homeland population. They were not usually from wealthy or affluent families, however. The average sum of money brought by Japanese immigrants to America ranged from about $11 in 1896 to a high of $26 in 1904. More like the poverty-stricken Eastern and Southern European immigrants than like the immigrants from Northern and Western Europe. Their selectivity was not financial, but in terms of human potential. The male Issei were a group pre-selected in Japan by the government for their health, character, and willingness to work. They also grew up in an era where the people of Japan were predisposed to accept and emulate the American way of life. The women who sailed across the Pacific to join them in America were sufficiently traditional and dutiful to go halfway around the world to marry men selected for them, sight unseen, by their parents in Japan. Both the males and the females were an uncommon generation in terms of their values and self-discipline. The rising role of Japan on the world scene made it easy for them to maintain their pride in being Japanese, while following American ideals that were already part of the culture in Meiji Japan. The Issei were an educated people who valued reading, although their occupations were overwhelmingly manual, in either agriculture or industry. Almost all could read and write Japanese, and numerous Japanese language newspapers flourished among them. While literacy in Japanese was of no immediate economic value to American employers, it was indicative of their cultural level, and literacy, even in a foreign language, has long been associated with economic progress in America for many races and nationalities. In short, education is generally a symptom of other social characteristics, such as local, class, or family aspirations, and the inculcation of individual values and traits likely to help realize such aspirations. Among Japanese males born in Japan, the general level of education in the prefecture from which they originated was more highly correlated with their later success in America than was their own individual education. The ambitions and character traits of their locality may have been more fundamental factors in their level of success. Quantitatively, the Japanese immigration to the United States was quite small, despite widespread cries of yellow hordes or a yellow peril in California in the early 20th century. The largest immigration recorded for any year was about 30,000 Japanese in 1907 and 40,000 Chinese in 1882. Even if unrecorded illegal immigration was enough to double these figures, they would still amount to a tiny fraction of the immigration from Europe. At its peak in 1907, Japanese immigration was less than 3% of the total immigration to the United States. Moreover, the return migration to Japan was high. From the time of the Gentlemen's Agreement of 1908 to the complete cutoff of immigration from Japan and other countries in 1924, about 160,000 Japanese arrived, and about 70,000 departed. Their concentration in parts of California created an impression of a much larger Japanese invasion than in fact existed, and even in California, the Japanese were never more than 3% of the total population. As a noted economic historian observed, seldom have so few innocuous people inspired so much irrational hatred and apprehension. In Hawaii, where the Japanese were a larger proportion, more than 20% of the population, the alarm was not nearly so great. However, even in Hawaii, there was pay discrimination against the Japanese and efforts to block their rise into skilled occupations. A strike of Japanese agricultural laborers in 1909 exacerbated relations between the whites and the Japanese, although it produced some benefits to the Japanese field hands. Discrimination in pay against the first Japanese immigrants eroded as Japanese Americans became farmers and employers of Japanese farm laborers. Initially, white farm laborers were paid more by the hour than were the Japanese, but received less when both were paid on a piecework basis because the Japanese workers produced more output. However, Japanese farmers paid Japanese farm workers higher wages than the white farmers paid them, and so forced the white farmers to increase the pay of Japanese employees. After 1909, the discrimination against Japanese farm workers had virtually disappeared. A decade later, Japanese farm workers actually received higher wages than white farm workers due to the greater efficiency of the Japanese, which was now widely recognized. The Japanese tenant farmers also prospered, even though they paid higher rents than whites for the same land. This economic discrimination against the Japanese had its political offset, however. The higher rents paid by Japanese tenant farmers meant that an influential class, large white landowners, had an incentive to resist attempts to force the Japanese off the land altogether, as the original version of the Alien Land Bill attempted to do. The political compromise that went into law allowed the Japanese to lease land, even if they could not own it. These laws passed both houses of the California legislature by nearly unanimous votes, an indication of the strong anti-Japanese feeling in California, which would lead to many other laws and practices directed against the Issei. The actual effectiveness of the Alien Land Law in stopping the economic rise of the Japanese is much more questionable. World War I followed almost immediately after the Alien Land Law of 1913, and because many white farm workers left agriculture for better-paying jobs in the factories, the Japanese were in great demand as tenants. Moreover, loopholes in the law allowed many of the more prosperous tenant farmers to become de facto landowners. With the birth of children of the Nisei generation, there were now Japanese who were native-born American citizens, able to own land and exercise many other rights denied their parents. Much land was owned by Japanese families in the names of children. Sometimes sympathetic whites held legal title to land actually farmed as their own by Japanese farmers who bought it. Some dummy corporations were also formed to evade the Alien Land Law. By 1920, these evasions had become so widespread and so well known that these loopholes were plugged by a new law, passed as an initiative by a 3-to-1 vote of the electorate. The Alien Land Law of 1920 now forbade the leasing of land by aliens ineligible for citizenship, Asians, as well as ownership, and sought to outlaw the holding of land in the name of native-born children. But court decisions and new evasive devices enabled the Japanese to hang on in California agriculture. A majority of employed Japanese males were farmers as late as 1940. The law was not wholly ineffective in reducing the acreage owned by the Japanese or in creating costly obstacles to their economic rise. It simply did not completely stop them. One reason was that, almost inevitably, a growing proportion of the Japanese American population consisted of people born in the United States and therefore not covered by the laws against aliens ineligible for citizenship. The 14th Amendment prevented the law from specifying the Japanese as its intended victims. By 1930, about half of all Japanese Americans in the continental United States were native-born. By 1940, about a third of the value of all commercial truck crops grown in California was produced by Japanese Americans. In addition to their success in agriculture, Japanese Americans became celebrated in California for their skillful work in the related fields of entrepreneurial or contract gardening. The Japanese gardener became an institution among the white middle-class homeowners whose lawns and yards he tended on weekly visits. It was a small business that required little capital and yet offered independence, for the gardener who collected fees from many homeowners was not the servant of any. As early as 1928, there were 1,300 Japanese gardeners in Southern California alone. Another offshoot of the Japanese success in agriculture was the produce market, usually marketing the output of Japanese farms. In 1929, there were more than 700 Japanese-owned produce markets in Los Angeles alone. The Japanese also moved into entrepreneurial ventures not associated with the soil, and were highly successful there as well. By 1919, almost half of the hotels and 1/4 of the grocery stores in Seattle were owned by Japanese. In Los Angeles, Issei owned dry cleaners, lunch counters, and fisheries, as well as cheap hotels. Some of the Japanese-owned businesses began as enterprises serving the needs of their own immediate ethnic community, especially in meeting the special food preferences of the Japanese. However, the number and volume of business of many Japanese-American enterprises went far beyond what could be supported by the ethnic community alone. Moreover, some of the Japanese-owned businesses, such as gardening and produce markets, were known to have served an almost exclusively non-Japanese clientele. The ability of the Japanese to move up from manual labor to small business ownership was only partly a result of their own individual thriftiness. They, like the Chinese, made use of revolving credit associations to pool funds to finance new businesses. But this simple institution depended for its success on a whole complex of relationships of trust based on family and community ties and concepts of honor, which would have made defaults virtually impossible. Equally important, and for some businesses more important, was the sheer willingness to undertake the risks of entrepreneurship and the diligence and persistence to make a success of a new business. The amount of capital needed to become a gardener was only a small truck, a lawn mower, some shears, rakes, and other similar tools. The personal equipment was much more decisive. The reputation that the Japanese had earned as diligent and trustworthy workers in such occupations as farm laborers and houseboys made many homeowners willing to trust them in the new field of contract gardening, which involved to some extent exposing their homes and valuables to them. The principal occupations of more than 90% of the Issei men were in farming, business, and blue-collar work. All the professional and clerical workers of that generation put together added up to less than 10% of the Issei. In short, the initial economic rise of Japanese Americans was not due to education, nor was it in occupations requiring education. After the Issei had achieved a measure of economic success, they were able to send their children, the Nisei, on to higher education, and from there into the professions and other occupations requiring formal training. The Japanese, like the Chinese, studiously avoided political agitation for their rights, although they did fight numerous court cases. As in the case of the Chinese, the fever pitch of anti-Oriental feeling could not be maintained over decades, as the Japanese quietly went their way and prospered. Moreover, the Japanese-American community did not provide the sensationalist press with a stream of lurid stories about Tong wars, opium dens, and vice districts, such as came out of contemporary Chinatowns. The quiet and often rural life of Japanese Americans did not make news. Japanese families of the first generation were larger than American families in general. The birth rate of Japanese Americans was 4 times that of whites, lending credence to the fears of those afraid of inundation by this very small group of people. However, one reason for high birth rate statistics was that a disproportionate number of Japanese Americans were young adults in the prime of life. Very few elderly people or children had immigrated. Moreover, the young men and women were from a rural culture, where fertility rates are usually high around the world. Japanese families were extremely stable. Very few divorces ever occurred. The children were controlled strictly, but their well-being was paramount to the parents, who often sacrificed greatly for the children's current and future well-being. Strong family obligations were reciprocal. One sign of the parental care among Japanese Americans is that their children had far fewer accidents than either white or black children. Japanese children in the public schools were notable for their obedience, politeness, and hard work, and were welcomed by their teachers. The schools attended were almost always integrated because of the small number of Japanese children at any given place, and they were typically treated well by their teachers. These children's school achievements were equal to those of white children, and so were their IQ scores, despite the fact that they came from homes where English was not spoken and where parents' occupations, and their own occupational prospects in light of contemporary discrimination, made formal education of little apparent value. It was simply regarded as a matter of honor that they do well. Upholding the honor of the family and the honor of the Japanese people in America were values constantly taught by the Issei to their children. Strong family control, pressure, and influence were supplemented by that of community organizations, and by the informal but pervasive gossip in the small, close-knit Japanese-American communities. Such social controls extended well beyond children. These American communities were notable for their lack of crime, juvenile delinquency, or other forms of social pathology. From the earliest period of immigration, the Japanese American community had far fewer crimes than other Americans, and the crimes they did commit were less serious. This was true both on the mainland of the United States and in Hawaii. Deviant behavior brought forth pressure not only from the individual's family, but also from other relatives, neighbors, and members of the Japanese American community at large. Few individuals could stand up to such pressures. The rare individual who continued to defy community norms could find himself being shipped back to Japan, rather than being allowed to tarnish the image of Japanese Americans in the larger society. Unbridled individualism was not part of the Japanese system of values, in which the well-being of the community was paramount. There is no Japanese word for privacy. The Japanese Association was founded soon after the arrival of the Issei on American soil. Its branches in various cities served both as internal community control organizations and as liaisons with the outside world. The Japanese Association helped to curtail prostitution, gambling, and other activities that would reflect adversely on Japanese Americans in the eyes of the larger society. It sponsored recreational and civic activities. It also reported crimes or grievances of individual Japanese to the police, other American authorities, or, because the Issei were legally citizens of Japan, to the Japanese consulate. It was, in short, the organized voice of the first generation of Japanese Americans. Smaller organizations also crisscrossed the Japanese American communities. People from particular regions of Japan belonged to their own respective prefecture organizations in America. These provided recreational and social outlets and aid to those in distress. This aid was accepted only in dire need because of the disgrace that was felt in accepting charity. However, between family aid and aid from internal Japanese American community organizations, almost no Japanese American went on public relief. Even after the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, when 10,000 Japanese were left homeless, virtually none applied for relief because their prefecture organizations organized massive aid for them. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, almost no Japanese went on relief. The Nisei. The generation gap between the first and second generations of Japanese Americans was in some respects greater than in other immigrant groups. The belated formation of families, due to the initial sex imbalance among the Issei, meant that the age gap between parents and children was larger than usual. As of 1942, the average age of Issei males was 55, while that of Nisei was only 17. Most of the Issei spoke Japanese and little English, while most of the Nisei spoke English and very little Japanese. In the 1930s, 3/4 of the Issei were Buddhists, while half of the Nisei were Christians. Moreover, the values that the Nisei learned at school and from the American culture were often in conflict with the values of the Issei, especially on such things as dating and arranged marriages. Attempts were made to strengthen the hold of traditional Japanese values on the Nisei by sending them to Japanese language schools after public school hours or on weekends. These schools, often taught by instructors imported from Japan, sometimes taught the ultranationalism that had become increasingly strident in Japan. To some of the Nisei, these schools were seen as social institutions in which to meet other Japanese American youths. To others, the indoctrination was offensive and another cause of friction between the generations. As a high school student in 1939, Daniel Inoue was thrown bodily out of such a school in Hawaii when he objected to what was being said. However, these schools were diverse in politics and religion, and the Nisei were diverse in the extent to which they attended, virtually all going to the schools in Honolulu and virtually none in some areas of the continental United States. As the Nisei came of age, they formed their own separate organizations, finally consolidated into the Japanese American Citizens League, JACL, which eventually supplanted the Japanese Association of the Issei as the voice of Japanese Americans. The JACL promoted Americanism in culture and politics. The Nisei were not subject to the legal discriminations their parents had suffered. Their efforts were bent toward gaining more acceptance in the larger American society, to which they were qualified by virtue of their education and acculturation. One sign of the internal generational stresses within the Japanese American community were the bilingual newspapers that circulated there. These papers not only covered the same stories in both languages to reach both Issei and Nisei, but often covered their political stories from different editorial points of view. While organizations composed of Issei tended to either support or rationalize Japan's aggressions in the 1930s, the JACL creed of the Nisei began, "I am proud to be an American citizen of Japanese ancestry," and expressed a willingness to defend the United States against all enemies. That was written in 1940. Just 1 year later, that loyalty would be put to the acid test. Wartime internment. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a massive surprise attack on the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, inflicting the most catastrophic defeat ever suffered by the Americans. The shock was compounded by the fact that, 1. The sneak attack was launched in the midst of a peace mission by Japanese diplomats in Washington, and that 2. A simultaneous military offensive launched by Japan in the Western Pacific inflicted a series of devastating defeats on the United States and other Western powers over the next several months. Fears were rampant that the west coast of the United States would be the next target of military attack or even invasion. American anger and apprehensions about Japan turned also against Japanese Americans. This was sometimes expressed sporadically in verbal abuse or outbreaks of physical violence, more officially in FBI roundups of about 1,500 Japanese Americans as potential threats to American security. A roundup publicly supported by Nisei leaders, who saw the pro-Japanese position of their elders as disloyalty to the United States and as a threat to Japanese Americans in general. However, the scope of the hysteria and the roundups expanded at unpredictable intervals, and in February 1942, President Roosevelt signed an executive order giving the Army authority to evacuate any and all persons from military areas as designated by the Army to provide accommodations for them elsewhere. The executive order did not mention Japanese Americans, but it was they alone who were rounded up en masse on the West Coast. Between March and November 1942, more than 100,000 men, women, and children were shipped off to huge internment camps in isolated, barren regions scattered from California to Arkansas. These locations were places where nobody had lived before and no one has lived since. Ironically, no such roundup was made of the 150,000 Japanese Americans in Hawaii, where the attack on Pearl Harbor occurred. The virulent anti-Japanese feelings in the continental United States and the personality of the general in charge of the Western Defense Command apparently had more to do with the internment policy than the military necessity used to justify it. General J.L. DeWitt was an elderly career bureaucrat with experience primarily in supply units rather than in combat units, and was held in low esteem by other generals. The internment camps for Japanese Americans represented a vast expansion of his bureaucratic empire and public importance. But what made that possible was the pervasive hysteria and hostility toward Japanese, whether in Japan or in America. General DeWitt echoed a widespread opinion in the post-Pearl Harbor days when he declared publicly, "A Jap's a Jap, and it makes no difference whether he is a citizen or not." The public support for the internment of Japanese Americans stretched across the spectrum, from the Hearst newspapers and racist bigots like the columnist Westbrook Pegler on the right to outstanding liberals like Earl Warren and Walter Lippmann, leftists like Carey McWilliams, Vito Marcantonio, and the editors of the communist Daily Worker and People's World. The executive order authorizing internment was accepted as legitimate by the American Civil Liberties Union and by a unanimous Supreme Court. But despite the virtually unanimous fears of the times, not a single Japanese American was ever convicted of a single act of sabotage during all of World War II. The impact of the mass internment on the Japanese Americans was devastating. The financial impact alone was massive. There were forced, hasty sales of homes, furniture, and other belongings before being shipped off to internment. Businesses built over a lifetime of hard work had to be liquidated in a few weeks. The financial losses of the Japanese Americans were estimated by the government itself at about $400 million at 1942 price levels. Added to the financial losses were the many personal traumas of forced uprooting and internment, and the body blow to the leadership of the Japanese American Citizens League, representing the Nisei efforts to become and be accepted as good Americans. The JACL's official position was one of cooperation with the internment, realizing the futility of resistance and the implication of disloyalty to America if they were to attempt to resist. But this position made the JACL vulnerable to the anger and scorn of those Japanese Americans who saw the internment as a racist slap in the face, despite all their previous efforts to be good, productive citizens. Sometimes bitter internal dissension erupted among the interned Japanese. A few of the more militant objectors renounced their American citizenship and even used force and threats to get other internees to do the same. By and large, however, Japanese Americans accepted the internment as a grim fact of life and put their efforts into making the best of a bad situation. The camps typically had mass, primitive facilities for eating in mess halls or using communal bathing and toilet facilities. Families were crowded into small quarters inside an area surrounded by barbed wire fences and patrolled by armed sentries. The Japanese tried to humanize their environment by doing such things as planting gardens and building furniture out of scraps of wood. But there were limits to beautification possible with long rows of tar paper-covered wooden barracks and rooms containing a stove, a drop light, an iron cot, and mattress. Life within the internment camps considerably altered traditional Japanese roles and patterns of life. The very low wages paid for performing various tasks in camp were the same for women as for men, for young or old, and so the role of the father as primary breadwinner was completely undermined. Moreover, those positions of responsibility in the camp administration available to Japanese Americans were available only to American citizens, that is, the younger generations, who were elevated above their elders. The tiny quarters packed together destroyed the privacy of the family. Family-centered activities, such as meals, were taken out of the home. The manpower needs of wartime America began to erode the internment programs, even before all the Japanese Americans had been put behind barbed wire. In the spring of 1942, some seasonal agricultural laborers were allowed furloughs to help ease farm labor shortages. These furloughs were later changed to permanent relocations outside the camps, provided that the work was located outside the restricted military area and that the individuals had passed loyalty tests. In the summer of 1942, hundreds of Issei Railroad workers were allowed to return to their jobs in eastern Oregon. More than 4,000 Nisei college students were allowed to leave to resume their studies in the East or Midwest, so as to circumvent rather than challenge the military necessity rationale for the Western Defense Command's roundup. The civilian authorities in charge of the internment camps were generally more sympathetic to the Japanese, and their various plans for releasing special groups were repeatedly denounced by the military. Finally, however, even the military high command began to tap the manpower of Japanese Americans. In January 1943, the U.S. Army began to recruit Nisei, who had previously been classified as ineligible for military service as enemy aliens. Despite the anomaly of the situation and the bitterness of some of the interned Japanese youth, most of those eligible seized the opportunity to prove their loyalty in combat. More than 300,000 Japanese Americans fought in World War II. Separate Japanese American units fought in the European theater of the war. They were sent into some of the bloodiest fighting of the war in 1943 and their 442nd Regimental Combat Unit emerged the most decorated combat unit in World War II or in American history. They suffered more than 9,000 casualties in action against Nazi troops and earned 52 Distinguished Service Crosses and a Congressional Medal of Honor. In the Pacific, several thousand Japanese Americans served as interpreters, a valuable military role, for the military forces of Japan often failed to code their messages, assuming that Americans could not understand Japanese. But there were nisei on every battlefront, reading captured documents and passing information on to Allied commanders. The tragic wartime experiences of the Japanese Americans proved ultimately to be a turning point in their history in the United States. Never had a group so proved their loyalty under impossible conditions. Gradually, more and more American officials advocated their cause, some within the government and others publicly. Eventually, even the Western Defense Command announced an end to the military necessity used to justify the roundup, and the civilian authorities announced that the camps would be closed down. President Roosevelt, whose executive order in 1942 had authorized the rounding up of Japanese Americans, was by mid-1944 publicly defending their loyalty. By the end of 1944, the Supreme Court declared unconstitutional the internment of those Japanese who were American citizens. Despite the large and irreparable losses suffered by the Issei, for the Nisei, the internment camps marked the beginning of a new movement into American society and a rapid rise up the social and economic ladder. The old bonds of a narrow ethnic world were broken. No longer need they follow the few occupations in which their fathers had worked. In the internment camps, Japanese Americans worked at a wider range of jobs than in civilian life, where occupational licenses and other restrictive devices and practices constricted their occupational choices. The Nisei, as citizens, were privileged among the internees in the camps and were disproportionately represented among those first released from the camps. Their resettlement in eastern and midwestern locations opened up new opportunities. Their own dedicated work, whether as college students or as soldiers, won acceptance and support from other Americans. Bigots were not completely silenced, and isolated incidents of varying degrees of seriousness occurred, particularly in California, as the interned Japanese made their way back from the camps in post-war America. But a new trend was clearly marked in 1946, when, for the first time in California history, an anti-Japanese initiative was defeated by the voters overwhelmingly. Post-war Nisei and Sansei. The pre-war progress of Japanese Americans could not be simply resumed in the same patterns. Thousands of farms and businesses were irrevocably lost. Many of the Issei were simply too old to start them all over again, and lacked the education and acculturation to move into new fields with any great success. Contract gardening, however, could be readily resumed, and as late as 1958, about 3/4 of all Japanese-owned businesses in Los Angeles were in this field. These are by no means inconsequential jobs. A 1963 survey found that a significant portion of the upper-income Japanese Americans, as of that date, were contract gardeners. The Nisei were, however, well-educated and English-speaking, free of the occupational constrictions based on citizenship requirements, and able to take on the informational barriers of bias among employers. As early as 1940, Japanese Americans had more education than whites, and the gap widened over the next decade. The college degrees were almost never in liberal arts, but were instead in applied areas such as engineering, optometry, or business administration. By 1959, Japanese American males on the mainland of the United States earned 99% of the income of whites. For the total Japanese American male population, including those in Hawaii, Japanese American income was 98% of white income in the same age bracket. By 1969, the average personal income of Japanese Americans was 11% above the national average, and average family income was 32% above. The rise of Japanese Americans on the mainland was more rapid than in Hawaii, suggesting that the wartime internment need not have had a permanently negative effect. Perhaps it even had a positive effect in narrowly economic terms, by freeing the Nisei from the restrictive bonds of parental expectations, particularly as regards taking over the family business rather than pursuing new fields. In this regard, many Japanese Americans themselves, including Senator S.I. Hayakawa, have credited the internment experience with improving their long-run mobility. Whatever the reasons, there was not only an economic rise, but also a striking change in occupational distribution among Japanese Americans. In 1940, the proportion of Japanese Americans working in professional occupations was less than half that of whites, both in California and in Hawaii. By 1950, the Japanese Americans in California had narrowed the gap, and by 1960 had slightly more representation than whites in professional occupations. In Hawaii, the Japanese still lagged behind whites in professional occupations. Along with a general socio-economic rise of Japanese Americans and a general decline in racism in post-war America, has come a new pattern of residential dispersion and intermarriage. Nisei, who worked in high-level white-collar jobs, tended to live in predominantly white neighborhoods and were less likely to belong to Japanese ethnic organizations. Indeed, in the continental United States, all Japanese neighborhoods became unusual. Intermarriage has increased over the decades as the Japanese Americans dispersed occupationally and residentially. In the 1920s, only about 2% of all Japanese American marriages in Los Angeles were with non-Japanese partners. In the immediate post-war period, this rose to 11 to 12%. By the late 1950s, the proportion had climbed to over 20%. A similar pattern existed in Hawaii. The third generation of Japanese Americans, the Sansei, was born early in the wartime internment camps or in post-war America. A remarkable 88% of the Sansei have attended college, and 92% intend to become professionals. Most of their elders consider them too American, but they themselves, 94%, say that they would like to be able to speak Japanese, meaning that they do not. Moreover, they are among the most vocal about the wartime internment, of which they have no personal memory. Political militancy has been a phenomenon confined largely to the Sansei. It has been a widespread phenomenon among many ethnic groups to find heightened or more militant group consciousness among the third generation, that is, among those who have suffered least and have retained the least of the cultural characteristics of the group. Japanese Americans today. There are today about 600,000 Japanese Americans. About a third of them live in Hawaii, another third in California, and less than 1/5 live in the Northeast, Midwest, and South combined. Although they began in the United States as agricultural laborers and tenant farmers, today about 90% of Japanese Americans live in urban areas, and even among those in rural areas, most are not on farms. About 88% are native-born Americans, but nearly 70% of the working-age males, 25 to 64 years old, are only second-generation Americans. The geographic location and urbanization of Japanese Americans are important factors in their above-average incomes. Less than 5% live in the low-income South, and most live in the high-income states of California and Hawaii. While their median family incomes are 32% above the national average, in California, Japanese American family income is only 15% above the statewide average, and among urbanized California families, the Japanese Americans earn only 11% more than urbanized whites. Still, this is a remarkable achievement for a group that has advanced in the face of decades of discriminatory laws and practices, and that had to start all over again after losing virtually everything during their internment in World War II. And this is only the second generation. The third generation, Sansei, is just entering adulthood, and the fourth generation, Yonsei, are still children. The economic achievements of Japanese Americans today are due primarily to 1. They're working more, a higher than average percentage are in the labor force, a lower than average percentage are unemployed, and a higher proportion of Japanese American families have multiple income earners. And 2. Higher than average levels of education, combined with a concentration in higher paying scientific and applied fields. Historically, the Japanese Americans' rise came in occupations requiring little or no education: farming, contract gardening, small business ownership, and only after the Issei had succeeded in these fields were they able to send the Nisei off to college to pursue professional careers. Education was not the cause of the Japanese Americans' initial rise, just as it was not the cause of the Jews' initial rise, although both groups consolidated and further enhanced their economic positions in later generations with formal schooling. And here follows a table. Family earnings of Japanese American male-headed families, Japanese income as a percentage of U.S. income in the same categories. So, education of family head. Less than high school. In one-income families is 107%. In two-income families is 120%. Three or more income earners, 140%. High school level. One-income families is 105%. Two-income families is 120%. Three or more income earners is 118%. College 1 to 3 years level. One-income families is 101%. Two-income families is 112%. Three or more income earners is 104%. College of 4 years level. One-income families is 84%. Two-income families is 104%. Three or more income earners is 123%. Postgraduate for 1 year level. One-income families is 90%. Two-income families is 108%. And three or more income earners is 111%. Lastly, postgraduate for 2 years or more level, one-income families is 83%, two-income families is 100%, three or more income earners is 106%. And this source is 1970 U.S. Census publicly used sample. The Japanese have no consistent income advantage in families with one breadwinner, see above, and in almost no category do they have an economic advantage as large as their 32% higher family incomes, which results from their different distribution among these categories. More Japanese are working, and more are in higher educational brackets. The economic and social positions of Japanese American families are enhanced by their smaller families. While the average American woman in the 35 to 44-year-old bracket has 3 children, the average Japanese American woman in the same age bracket has 2.2 children. With fewer children to support and higher incomes, the Japanese American family has not only a higher standard of living, but also can more readily afford to send its children to college to perpetuate its advantages. But again, it is necessary to distinguish the situation of the current generation from the factors that led to the initial rise of Japanese Americans. The Issei had larger than average families, just as the Jewish immigrants had larger than average families. In neither case did the larger family imply neglected children or disruptive behavior in schools. Later generations had smaller families to fit a new lifestyle and college aspirations for children. By any index, Japanese Americans are assimilating. Nationally, about 12% of married Japanese American men and about a third of married Japanese American women had spouses of a different race in 1970. In Los Angeles County in the early 1970s, about half of all new Japanese American marriages were intermarriages. The same was true of Hawaii. Among the youth, the high grade point average of earlier generations of Japanese American students was found to be gradually declining toward the norm, while social problems among them were rising. Japanese Americans have made notable contributions in many aspects of American life. The beautiful and imaginative designs of architect Minoru Yamasaki can be seen in buildings and structures from coast to coast, including the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, the Oberlin Conservatory of Music, the St. Louis Airport, and the Seattle World's Fair. In the field of semantics, S.I. Hayakawa established a renowned scholarly reputation long before he became known to the general public as president of San Francisco State College and then United States Senator. Japanese Americans have been relatively late participants in politics on the mainland, but have been more active in Hawaii, where they have constituted a larger proportion of the population. In 1959, Daniel K. Inouye, a hero of World War II who lost an arm in battle and received a battlefield commission, was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, and later, 1962, was elected to the U.S. Senate, where he still serves. In 1976, Hawaii also sent Masayuki Matsunaga to the U.S. Senate as the third Japanese-American senator. 3% of the Senate, from less than half of 1% of the population. It was symbolic of the remarkable achievements of Japanese Americans.